All right. Sorry about the slight delay starting. I'm having some technical difficulties. My Dell tablet laptop thing that I usually use, for some reason, decided it doesn't want to pick up any mic audio. So I'm going to probably have to, I don't know, dig into the drivers and see what the heck went wrong. It probably started with the last Windows update, so we'll figure it out from there. All right, so welcome back to SOC 100. So again, we're in Intro to Sociology. So last time we introduced the course. We kind of laid out what the structure of the course is going to be, and we started a little bit talking about some concepts and theories. So we're going to keep going on with that today. A couple of notes, or a couple of things to just, I guess, mention. If you have any questions, about the course, I know people are kind of swapping in and out in the first few days, so feel free to, join the Slido we use for the class, and you can ask any questions for the first few minutes. What are the usual questions? Do I need the textbook? It's optional, so you only need it if it's helpful. The exams are non-cumulative, so you don't have to worry about that. And I can't think of what any of the other, which I just said. So you don't need it, it's optional. And all that jazz. So if you have any other questions, right, you can obviously come talk to me after class or anything, and or throw them in the chat. We'll try to keep it topical for now. The other thing I'll say is, last time obviously we had some fun with the Q&A on, in the slides here, and I'm not adverse to having a bit of fun and joking around a little bit. I'm fine with that. If we can just not let it completely take over the Slido, because it does get a little bit hard sometimes to figure out what's a legitimate question, rather than what, if you're just messing with me, right? And I only once in my 7 or 8 times using Slido in a course have I ever had to actually just stop using it because people were being too goofy. So I don't want to do that, obviously, because I think it's a useful tool. It gives you a chance to ask questions. But let's keep the jokey ones, to a minimum, right? And try to keep things appropriate. But I don't want you to not ask questions, and I don't want to not have fun. And you can joke around a little bit, but let's just not overwhelm the Q&A with that, because I don't want it to detract from the course and all of that stuff. Okay. These are questions from last time. What about OnlyFans? I presume you're asking if OnlyFans is a microstructure or a macro structure. I mean, there's a macro structure there, clearly, because, OnlyFans is a sort of a company and an institutional player. But then, your interactions with all the OnlyFans models that you pay for, I presume, wholesome things. You're probably there for their fitness routines or the recipes they share on OnlyFans. I'm going to assume it's that and not anything else. Those would be, I think, kind of micro interactions mediated through the internet, but micro interactions nonetheless, unless you're a fan of Lily Phillips and you got picked. Other than that, who knows? If you know what I'm talking about, If you don't know, please don't look it up. It's gross. Okay, with someone having physical insecurities being a result of beauty standards set by society be an example. Yeah, so I presume this question is asking, and it was from last time, I didn't get to it last time, is asking about the sociological imagination. And yeah, seeing someone, if you're seeing an individual who's having trouble with aligning themselves with beauty standards, and that being a result of kind of societal structures, that would be an example, yes, of having the sociological imagination. Is an interaction with an employer macro, or micro? So if you are talking to your boss, right? So you are at work and you are talking to your boss and you're interacting with them on that level, that is certainly a microstructure. However, you interacting with, say, the company as a whole, right? Like, or your department of the company, like HR, you'd probably be moving into a macro structure. Okay. Does the sociological imagination mean empathy or the ability to empathize, or is it a component of empathy? I mean, in a lot of cases, say you're doing something like qualitative research, right? So you're talking to people. There is a lot of empathy involved, but just understanding, how the problems that someone's having in their life might be related to broad social structures doesn't, I think, technically require empathy. You can understand it and be very emotionally detached from it. And there's a big debate in sociology of how detached people should be, with some people saying you should empathize with the people you're researching, and others saying you have to have that almost scientific detachment from the question. Okay, is government a macro or a global structure? What about a country? So, I mean, government, when you think about government is not really a single thing, right? Government is made up of a bunch of institutions, right? You think of the government of Canada, it will be made up of things like the PMO, the Prime Minister's Office, the House of Parliament, right? Department of National Defense, like all of these different institutions that make up the government. Each of those are macro structures, right, in and of themselves. Countries, I think you can make the case that they're more of a global structure, right, because they're interacting with other structures globally, right? They're negotiating, treaties with other countries. They fight wars. They join other even bigger global structures like the UN or NATO or the BRICS or something like that. Okay, great questions. Okay, I don't know if this pen, for whatever reason, this laptop, the drawing lags a little bit compared to my other one. But the microphone doesn't work on the other one, so the live stream wouldn't work. So, where does sociology come from, right? When we talk about sociology and its origins, what are the origins of sociology as a discipline? So, we can basically point essentially to three kind of historical inflection points that all led to sociology becoming a discipline. And as disciplines go, it's relatively young, right? It really only appears in the 19th century, kind of towards the end of the 19th century, and really only gets recognized as a major part of the academy in the middle part of the 20th century. Before that, it was sort of a fringe thing that was done in Europe, and it's not till after the Second World War that it comes into the academy, like into universities in America, Canada, and the UK in major ways. Okay, so the three kind of historical inflection points or moments that we can talk about that contributed to the birth of sociology as a discipline are the scientific revolution, so somewhere around 1550 AD. So, basically, you probably all remember this, in a sense from high school. Somewhere in the middle of the 16th century, there's a big transition in terms of how people think of the best way to get knowledge is, right? And we go from, what you would have called, natural philosophy. I don't know why it was writing good and now it's not. It's hard to write when I can't see what I'm writing, but we'll do our best. Natural philosophy, right, which would have been philosophers thinking about the natural world. So you can think of people like Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, right, looking at the world and, with the power of their reason, trying to determine how the world works, right? So famously, if you've ever read any Aristotle, Aristotle thought everything in the world was made up of 5 principal elements, and that the way they acted in the world was based on what element they were a part of, right? And he was like, well, wood is clearly made of fire because when you heat it, it burns, right? When you get to the middle part of the 16th century, you shift to what we would call, the scientific method, right? And I'm sure you all know what this is, but basically the idea that the best way to know something about the world is through direct observation of it, right, and experimentation to confirm aspects of how the natural world works. So that changes the way that people think about how we get knowledge about the natural world. Okay, so that's our scientific revolution. The next important one, again, something you'll probably be at least passingly familiar with, is what's called the democratic revolution, right? And this comes out of a period of European, and again, starting about 1750, middle part of the 18th century. Oh, sorry, that should be AD, not Alberta, AD. The democratic revolution, right, which comes out of I hear feedback. I'm gonna turn the mic down just a touch, if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. Okay. Which comes out of a European philosophical kind of movement called the Enlightenment, right? So in the 18th century, you have this movement, the Enlightenment, and one of the principal ideas that comes out of the Enlightenment is that basically society is not a given, right? That the way the social order is organized is essentially contingent, right? It is changeable. It has not always been the way it is today, and that there's no reason necessarily that it should be the way it is right now. And this distinguishes it from, philosophical movements coming out of the Middle Ages that were more kind of religious in their orientation, that suggested that, the world was the way it was because God put it there, right? Because, you were a serf, working that family farm that your family had worked for 500 years, overseen by a feudal lord, overseen by the king. Why? Well, because God had put each of you in that position, and that's how the world was meant to be. You have this notion of the divine right of kings in the Middle Ages, which is, well, why are you the king? Well, I'm the king because God made me the king, right? And I'm there at God's pleasure. And the only way that, the king is gotten rid of is by God killing them, right? So the Enlightenment starts to shift this with the idea that, hey, none of this is given, right? Social forms and the way societies are organized are essentially, they're changing, they're contingent, they aren't all the way they've been, and the result of the social arrangements that people have with each other, and that we should be able to change them, and that really, functionally, they should work not necessarily for the people who are at the top of the social ladder, but they should work for everyone. And you get this idea, of a social contract, the idea that, legitimacy to govern comes from the consent of the people being governed, that they should have a choice, right? So you get this idea of democracy. And of course, you get this, probably taking its most distinct form in 1776 with the American Revolution, right? The American Revolution that wants to split those 13 American colonies off from Britain, right? And it's particularly to separate it from the influence of King George, right? With the idea that people should be able to choose their own government. And you have this slogan coming out of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, that basically the government should have no right to tax you on anything if you don't have a say in how you are being governed. That one is pretty durable, right? The American Revolution, USA, A-OK, until recently. And then you have, a much more unstable form, which you see coming in 1789 with the French Revolution, right? Now, the French Revolution is not nearly as durable as the American Revolution, right? You do get a democracy in France, but then that democracy is quickly supplanted by Napoleon, who turns it into an empire and appoints himself, emperor. And then, you bring the king back, and then you have more revolutions and more democratic governments. And I think, I can't remember, which French Republic we're in now. I think we're in the Fifth Republic. So, it's the fifth time that French democracy had fallen and then been re-established. So you have these two revolutions, though, that are seen as kind of paramount in the establishment of a new form of order. Okay. And then the final one is the Industrial Revolution, right? And again, you all learned about this, I'm sure, in social studies in high school, so I won't belabor the point. The Industrial Revolution is probably the most profound transformation in human life in kind of the history of the whole human race. Maybe, the agricultural revolution that happened sometime like 3000 BC comes close, because people went from hunter-gatherers to building settlements and farming and raising animals. But the Industrial Revolution is massive. And you go from, mostly an agricultural kind of economy where most people lived out in the countryside, farmed small plots of land, barely supported themselves. You had, skilled people who made small amounts of goods to, transitioning to, factories in major centers, producing large amounts of goods at big profits, and the whole dislocation of a social system. All the people who had been living on the farms, found themselves, no longer able to support themselves, moved into the cities to feed those, growing industrial centers and their needs for workers. So, why is the Industrial Revolution important? Well, one of the products of the Industrial Revolution, without putting too fine a point on it, is misery, right? A lot of human misery happens as a result of this transition. People move into hastily assembled cities. A lot of workers live in slums, work incredibly long hours for incredibly low pay in jobs that are often quite dangerous, right, where there's a lot of injuries. And here, in the Industrial Revolution, right, I have 1780 here, but the Industrial Revolution probably goes from about 1780 all the way until at least probably 1920 in its basic form, right? Before the fact of industrialization is mostly complete. So it's a long process that produces a lot of misery. And some of the early kind of people we'll call sociologists are living through that period, and they observe that misery, right, that's created by industrialization. They see how difficult it makes the lives of people, how much this change has upended, ways of doing things in the past. And, they start thinking about it. They start thinking, is this the best way to live? What can we do to alleviate these problems? How can we describe the problems created by industrialization? Okay, so probably if we're talking about, say, the grandfather of sociology as a discipline, we would be talking about this fellow. This is Auguste Comte. Comte was a social thinker, right, in France. Lived kind of from, you see the early industrial period to, well into the second half of industrialization, on the European continent, and then, in England and in the Americas. So, what does Comte want? Well, and why does he propose the idea that we should have this discipline called sociology, right? Basically, what he wants is, because what you see with the scientific revolution, and then the application of a lot of scientific discoveries in the Industrial Revolution, is that things improve really quickly, right? Science makes things better, right? It gives us better ways to grow food, better ways to make things, higher standards of living, all sorts of improvements. And Comte is like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could take that same scientific approach to society, right? If we studied society using the scientific method, could we use that same principle to improve society, right? So we're going to find the problems, in the production, in the production of societies. We're going to find the flaws in the system through scientific inquiry, and then we will go and we will fix those problems. And he coins the term sociology in 1838. Now, he doesn't really do any sociology, right? It's more of just an idea, right? And coming up with this sort of term like, I want, a science of society. But he leaves it to later thinkers to actually do it. And a lot of things, right, when we think of, what does sociology mean? Socio literally means society, and, logi comes from logos in the Greek, which means knowledge of, right? So it's just building knowledge about society. Bless you. All right. So probably our earliest actual sociologist of note is this fellow. So this is, he's British. This is Herbert Spencer. And Spencer, how to talk about Herbert Spencer. A revolutionary figure, and one that very much tries to apply, the science of his day, and especially the science that was seen as revolutionary, and try to think through how applying the same logic could potentially be beneficial for improving society. So, what was the science of the day? What was really new and hip in Herbert Spencer's time? This was the idea of evolution by natural selection, right? This theory coming from Charles Darwin. And so Spencer is like, hey, why don't we apply this same idea of evolution by natural selection to societies? Now, Spencer is very much a person of his time. He carries, within him all of the cultural chauvinism of the British elite and of European societies in general, who have gone out into the rest of the world, conquered good chunks of it, and encountered other societies which they have labeled as primitive, right? As compared to European societies. So Herbert theorizes that societies evolve in the same way as biological species do, right? And specifically, his idea is that societies go, essentially from simple to complex, right? So we start with, in the same way as evolution, kind of theorizes that we start with single-celled organisms, relatively simple, and then move to multi-cell organisms, and then, plants and animals and eventually human beings and all of that jazz. He thinks societies work the same way. So, very much committed to survival of the fittest and this notion that some societies are further along in this process than others. And like I said, very much a product of his time. So, someone like Spencer and people around him would have looked at the societies of say, indigenous people and said, okay, those are less evolved societies than our European societies. So he's like, through this process of natural selection, European societies have become the most complex. And we're going to drag those other societies that we've encountered up to our standards, right? So very much convinced of that and dedicated to this idea that some cultures are better than others. One of the other ideas that is embraced at this time, and Spencer is not alone in this, was that certain inequalities are required for societies to evolve, and that you have this notion of social Darwinism, right? That the strongest in society will survive and rise to the top. If you had a guy like Spencer or other people that are in the elite, why are they in the elite? Well, it must be because they are the most evolved, right? It's not because back in the day their family ended up through some act of providence owning land and being noble as opposed to the peasants. No, it must be because they are the most evolved part of that society. And so, for people like Spencer who are committed to this idea of social Darwinism, one of the things that they become really interested in, and this is where a discipline like sociology can actually go spectacularly wrong, with the idea of eliminating the undesirable elements of society in favor of those they find more desirable. So I'm going to quickly erase so I have some room to write. That worked less well than I'd hoped. Okay, I'm going to erase all ink on slide. So one of the things we see with Spencer's thinking, and that emerges from Spencer's thinking, is a movement called eugenics. And at its extremes, right, eugenics will suggest things for human beings like selective breeding. Now, this is never really, thank God, never really implemented in any major way, right? You do see it, picked up a little bit by the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. This idea, right, because the Nazis, one of the things they wanted, and they loved this idea of social Darwinism, they wanted to create the Übermensch, or the Superman, right? And how were they going to do it? Well, they were going to take, the super fittest German athlete who is a male and breed him, basically be like, okay, you go have sex with the most athletic, and Aryan German female, and the children you produce will be, genetically superior to everybody else. So you do see that a little bit in the Nazis, but you don't see as much of it in other parts of the world, because as it goes, people don't like to be told what to do. But you do see this, and you even saw it, to an extent in Canada. There were programs in places like Alberta and Ontario of selective sterilization, of sterilizing undesirable elements. So people who were disabled, right? People with physical or mental impairments, and then very critically, for someone like Spencer, people who were poor. He thought that people who were poor should be sterilized. And there's these very famous ads, that were, or campaigns that were promoted in the British Academy, where they took like a theoretical woman, right, and they traced back her lineage. She's a criminal, and they traced back her lineage, right? Her father was a drunk, her mother was a prostitute, and they go back and they show all the ways that, back 7 generations that this family is flawed, and the tagline was, 7 generations of garbage is enough, right? And they advocated sterilizing poor women like this, this person who had ended up in the criminal justice system. So you get these movements out of sociology, and this idea that, to improve society, we should apply a scientific process of, forcefully evolving our species by selectively breeding some, and, sterilizing others, based on how attractive their intelligence and their physical characteristics are. Now, like I said, this probably finds its ultimate kind of reflection in the Nazis, right? The Nazis are huge on these kinds of social Darwinist and eugenics policies, and they take a lot of thinking from people like Spencer and other thinkers like Nietzsche, and try to apply it to human beings. Now, thankfully, after the Second World War, when we start to understand the horror of what the Nazis did, a lot of this thinking is relegated, and people stop talking about eugenics, and it becomes kind of a dirty word. But it is definitely part of the heritage of sociology. Okay, so I think this points to an important aspect of sociology, and one that, I think anyone engaged in the field needs to be cautious of, right? There's this kind of tension, right? And this kind of conflict within sociology, because there is, this belief in the importance of science, right? And there is this, desire to work towards an ideal society. But one of the things that's happened in a lot of cases when sociological theories have been put into practice is the results are not always very good, right? So we always have to be cautious and sort of remember that at times, by describing the problem, that's one thing, but in then proposing solutions, sometimes, we get things spectacularly wrong, and we ourselves as sociologists can be the authors of a lot of human misery. And no one is a better example of this, I think, than the guy who I tried to circle just there and it didn't work. There we go. Which is Karl Marx, right? And of course, Marx, very prominent early sociologist, the one upon whom the Soviets and other communist regimes in the world based their ideology. And, it only cost something like 100 million people their lives. So, nothing serious. Do I test on dates? Great question. I should have said that. I do not test on dates. I'm not gonna ask you, what year do we talk about in terms of the scientific revolution? That's I don't want to say kid stuff, but it kind of is to me kid stuff, right? I don't care about you knowing the dates. I care about you knowing the concepts. So when we're going to talk about, Comte and Spencer, eugenics, social Darwinism, that's what I want you to remember. Whether you remember what his birthday was, I don't care that much about that. Okay. Okay. Are the ages of the philosophers important to know? No, again, not that important. Yes. How else? It's an introduction to sociology. I'm introducing you to the field, which includes its history. So yes, the history of it matters tremendously. All right. Doesn't the U of A have a huge history with eugenics? I prefer not to comment, but yes, absolutely. No, and I mean, everybody did, right? It was a major intellectual movement, and absolutely, Alberta practiced sterilization on people that were considered undesirable. And in the not too distant past, right, within living memory, some of the people who were sterilized by the province of Alberta, particularly because they were mentally handicapped, are still alive, right? And they've been given, big settlements in court battles. But this is not something, Indigenous women were sterilized as well, that's right. This is not something that exists in the very distant past, right? This is relatively recent, and there are still people alive that were sterilized by the state because of these ideas. Yeah, eugenics is considered a pseudoscience today, and there's no evidence. Because when people tried it, it didn't work, right? Genetics is much more complicated than people suspected it was, and just breeding Butch the linebacker with Cindy the cheerleader didn't necessarily produce the top mental and physical models, right? This didn't work out necessarily, right? So it's very much discredited today, but back in the day, right, people didn't know any better. They didn't have knowledge of genetics, and they hadn't lived through the experiments. So it was, in a lot of cases, widely believed and widely accepted in a lot of intellectual circles. Lobotomies are a slightly different thing. This was a lobotomy is where you cut out part of someone's brain. I'm going to blame that one on psychology, right? We can't lay lobotomies at sociology's feet. We're going to blame the psychologists for that. Is basically they thought that all aggression and criminal behavior came out of a particular part of the brain, and if you cut that part out of the brain of particularly socially disruptive individuals, you could make them functioning members of society, and all you really did was kind of damage their brain and remove a chunk of their personality, make them very pliant, but they weren't fully there anymore. Okay. I'm going to ignore that one. Shock therapy, a form of sterilization or eugenics? Shock, it's neither. That's what I was going to say. Electroshock therapy is a psychological treatment, and it, in certain cases, actually can be particularly effective. I have acquaintances, not friends, who were chronically depressed and suicidal and went through electroshock therapy. It wiped out 3 months of their memory, but it basically reset their brain and cured their depression. So, there's that. Okay. All righty. So, need more tea. Little side quest for us here. There are arguments out there, and from scholars of whom I have a particular affinity, and specifically here, this character. This is Christian Smith, who's a sociologist. And I think if I was going to list who I think are the best living and most kind of introspective living sociologists, I would put Christian Smith at number one on my list. Not everybody feels that way, but I certainly do. And one of the things that he's described sociology as having is what he calls a sort of sacred project, right? The sociology itself has a bunch of, and what he means by this is it has a bunch of assumptions about the world that it essentially takes as sacrosanct, right, or sacred, and that it advocates for in major ways, right? And he writes about this in this book, The Sacred Project of American Sociology. And if you ever, not for this class, unless you're, deeply interested, but if you move forward in sociology, you take a bunch of it, right? And especially if you take some advanced classes in social theory, I highly recommend reading this book because it's really, really interesting. And what Smith points out, I'm going to grab my highlighter here, is that sociology as it's come to be, right? And we'll talk about the thinkers that kind of contributed to this. We'll talk in major ways about Karl Marx, about Max Weber, and about Emil Durkheim. What's come out of the kind of origins of sociology is the following. And Smith says it's a visionary project, and what is its goal? Realizing the emancipation, right? The freeing of the equality and the moral affirmation of all human beings as autonomous, right? So they're allowed to do what they want. Self-directing, no one should be able to tell you what to do. There should be no social limits on your behavior in a lot of ways. Individual agents who should be able to live out their lives as they personally desire. And how do they do this? I'm going to highlight this in a different color, in green, by constructing their own favored identities, entering and exiting relationships as they choose, right? So you shouldn't be bound to any relationship you don't want to be in. And enjoying the gratification of experiential, material, and bodily pleasures. Right? So you should be able to do with your body whatever you want, right? So this, he thinks, is the basic project of sociology, right? To free people, to break them out of any social bonds that holds them in and forces them to suppress any part of themselves, allow them to create the identities that they want based on only their own desires, right? So if you're, do I have Stanley on the next slide? I don't. Sometimes I have Stanley Hauerwas on the next slide. Hauerwas puts it in a kind of interesting way, which I think Smith is kind of riffing on. The modernity, the period that we live in, is about creating people who basically have no identity other than the identity that they chose. So that basically you're not bound to anything from the past, right? So family, religion, race, class, gender, all of these things should only be determined by self-affirmation rather than being set by any kind of social norms. And Smith, and I think he's correct, thinks that this is the ultimate project of sociology in the United States and how it's shaped the rest of the world. So, for Smith, and I'll highlight this in, yet another color, because it's fun. So what stands at the core of sociology? That is a bad color to highlight in, because now you can't see anything. Try a different one. Blue. So what stands at the core of sociology is an idea of liberal individualism, or what we could call voluntarism, right? Basically the idea that you should choose from your own will. Voluntarism comes from the word voluntas, from Latin, or the will, right? So that basically you as an individual should be able to choose everything about yourself, regardless of when, where you were born. You should get to set your own life. And liberal individualism today is so ingrained in us that it's kind of just the water we swim in, right? We don't even notice that we're all deeply committed to this idea of liberal individualism. Okay, and yeah, this comes out of a period called modernity, which is very much the period that we live in today. Okay, how are we doing for time? We have a lot of time left. All right, so theories, right? What are theories in the sociological sense? Oops, I meant to switch back to my pen. Theories are, tentative explanations of some aspect of social life that states, how and why certain facts are related, right? So sociological ideas are usually expressed in the form of theories. Oh, sorry, I have one more. So we typically talk about theories on two levels. We can talk about middle ground theories and grand theories. Okay, so what is the difference between these two? So, middle ground theories. Middle ground theories are generally meant to sort of explain a single phenomenon, right? One aspect of the social world. So, you might have a middle ground theory, in sociology. You want to explain, let's say, why people who come from intact families tend to have, higher educational attainment, higher financial attainment well into their adult life, right? So you would do some research and you would come up with a theory saying that having, two parents who are married tends to confer onto people certain social advantages, related to how much time their parents spend with them, how much capital their parents have to invest in them, and emotional and psychological stability as compared to single parent families, right? That would be a middle ground theory because it seeks to explain a small phenomenon. Grand theories basically try to explain why society is the way it is, right? The whole thing. So often you'll find that grand theories will stray into history, they'll stray into economics, but they're going to explain like the whole social order. So as we talk about concepts and theories for sociology, we're going to be dealing a little bit with some of these big theories. And some of these would be things like, I guess what we call conflict theory, which is from Marx. Structural functionalism, which is from Durkheim, and then symbolic interactionism. And don't worry, I'll come back to all these terms. So Durkheim and symbolic interactionism from Weber, but we'll also look at things like feminism and other kinds of theories that seek to explain why the world is the way it is. Right, and don't worry, don't worry about the names there. We'll come back to all of these folks as we go through. Okay, so how do we get to theories? Well, typically, right, we do research, right? Research, at least in theory and sociology, is the process of systemically observing reality to assess the validity of a theory. Now, there's two basic directions, that we can go with this. Either we can, start with a theory, get data to test that theory, or we can start with information, right, with data, and then use it to build a theory. So we call this deduction, and we call this induction. And we do both in sociology, right? Okay, so again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. So, values, which Microsoft PowerPoint automatically put a heart to. What are values, right? Basically, values are ideas about what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, moral and immoral, helpful and unhelpful, what helps people flourish and what causes them not to flourish. And values, everybody has them. Sociology, I think, increasingly recognizes that it is not a values-free discipline. And most sociologists bring their values to the research they do because it informs essentially how what you study, how you interpret what you study, and what you think then are the solutions to social problems. Okay. Would the Habsburgs be an example of eugenics? If I'm thinking of the Habsburgs, I'm thinking of, the Habsburgs might have been more a function of inbreeding, which, is somewhat linked to an idea of eugenics, but it's a little bit less developed. It's more like, nobility and royalty can only marry each other, so they married close cousins, and the Romanovs had this problem as well. We'll be testing on the which philosophers come up or related to which ideas. Generally speaking, yes. Less so with the specific names of thinkers, and more so, this idea would be an example of which theory, right? So I'll go more with the broad theories than with the specific thinker. So I'd be less likely to ask you, hey, which philosopher would agree with this statement, as this statement represents which theory, right? I don't know if that helps. Okay. I think it might be C.S. Mills, but yes, that sounds like Mills. Okay, clear. Oh, I can't remember the name of it either. Okay, the core idea of sociology is to be able to freely express. How does a major political party's ideals apply? We'll express one form of what's more correct. I'm going to sidestep this question because I think the idea of sociology is more like you should get to be whoever you want to be, right? Unbound from any social strictures, right? So think about a lot of the debates we're having today about gender identity, right? I think for Smith, what he'd say is a lot of these debates, right, about, I don't want to quote Matt Walsh, but, what is a woman and who gets to decide what it means to be a woman, is based on this notion from sociology that you get to choose your identity, right? And that biological categories or religious tradition or any of these things are not going to restrict you in any way, right? So it's less about more correct, as like everybody gets to choose their own path and their own identity. So if you, let's say, for example, you're born Catholic, right? Your parents are Catholic and you're raised Catholic. This kind of idea of liberal individualism says you should be free to reject your identity as a Catholic or a Muslim based on whether you like it, rather than being bound to it because your family is Catholic and has been Catholic since the beginning of time, right? Okay. Wouldn't sacred project of sociology at least imply some connection or foundation for psychology? Sure, why not? I don't know. Okay, I'm not going to answer that. I think I talked about that again. Is religion a theory? Okay, I'll skip that as well. We'll talk about religion later in the course. Okay. Is there a reason why I'm going over all of this when your prof last semester didn't? I don't know. Maybe you weren't in a Sociology 100 class. I don't know. Maybe they have a different approach. I don't know. Why would you take Sociology 100 twice? That's my question. Did you fail? Don't answer that. Okay, okay. Maybe it's part of the reason there's been a change in profs. Lol. I lol with you. Okay, I don't know. I can't account for what happens when they give grad students control of courses, but I think it's important, and I'm in charge, so shh. Okay, can I explain middle ground theories again? All right, middle ground theories, super easy to understand, right? You're trying to explain a specific phenomenon, right? A specific aspect of the social world, right? So if you wanted to understand why certain people leave religion, right, and become, either atheists or nothing in particular, you'd be trying to develop a middle ground theory. If you're trying to explain, why everything in society works the way it does, right? And you want to take it from a Marxist perspective, right? You'd be like, oh, it's all because of, economics, right? And the history of change in the means of production, right? That everything is about inequality and economic control of the means of production, right? So you're trying to explain the whole society in a grand theory. In a middle range theory, you're trying to explain one thing, right? Like, why certain people leave religion, who's most likely to commit crimes, right? What leads to, deviant behavior. These are all middle range theories, right? You'd be doing research to develop a theory of why certain things happen, right? So does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. That's a poli-sci question. Also, political science calling itself a science is a joke. That's my opinion. It's not a science. Okay. You feel like the idea of identity is very limiting on people? Congratulations. You've deeply drunk of the well of liberal individualism, and you are the perfect example of what Smith is talking about. Okay, isn't that what government already does in the form? I don't know. Okay, I think we're... Let's stay on topic. Okay. Clear. All right. With the assumption that Western sociology being founded on the ethos of individual. Yes, I think that's in large part what Smith is talking about in the book. He suggests that this ethos of being based in liberal individualism leads sociology to consider only certain questions and not other questions. But that is a topic for a much more advanced class in social theory, and not for introduction to sociology, making me sorry that I introduced it in the first place. How are beliefs and values connected? Well, obviously, right, your beliefs, and especially your kind of understanding of how the world is set up, will influence your values, right? Will influence what you think is important. Okay, stop. Or I will take away your toys. Okay, what's the difference between political science and sociology? There seems to be a lot of overlap in theorists. We're better than they are, and we were here first. So that's the difference. We all use a lot of each other's theorists, right? But properly speaking, sociology was there long before political science ever came to be, on the horizon. Okay, so here's actually an example of a middle range theory. I can totally spell. Okay, so as an example of what sociology can help us kind of think about as social phenomena, one of the really classic examples from early sociology is the social phenomenon of suicide, right? Of people taking their own lives. So if we go back, into the past, prior to really the work that Emil Durkheim did on suicide at the beginning of the 20th century, people tended to think of suicide very much as an individual act, one that was actually sort of separated from a social context because it was seen as antisocial, right? You were actually removing yourself from society and making that decision solely about yourself as an individual. And when people tried to understand kind of why people took their own lives, they would look to people's subjective psychological states in a lot of cases. And one of the things that early studies of suicide, again, done by Emil Durkheim did, was to try to put the phenomenon of suicide into a social context. Okay, so Durkheim wrote a book. It's actually it's called On Suicide. And it's one of his early works, and it's really, really interesting and really, really pivotal. So what he did, right? is he went and he collected. So one of the interesting things about suicide as a social phenomenon is that we have really good data on it, right? Because governments have been keeping statistics on, suicide for a very long time, and they do so with a fair degree of accuracy. And so Durkheim went into public records, principally in Germany, and pulled up the public records showing kind of who the people were who were most likely to end their own lives, and tried to tease out whether there were patterns, right? How social relationships might be linked to suicide, right? And so he did a couple of things. So he looked at, the link between the rates of suicide and psychological disorders in different groups. And the groups that Durkheim was particularly interested in were different religious groups. So, what he found was that suicide rates and rates of psychological disorders often did not appear to correlate at all, right? So they didn't move. You didn't have like this straightforward relationship where, as you have more mental disorders, you have more suicide. In a lot of cases, what he actually found was the opposite. People with more mental disorders actually tended to take their lives less. And so he basically tried to dig in and figure out why this was. And what he comes up with is an idea about what he calls social solidarity, right? He argues that, suicide rates in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries actually varied as a result not of mental disorders, but as a result of social solidarity. And he came to this conclusion by looking, like I said, specifically at religious groups. And what he found was that a couple of religious groups had really, really low rates of suicide, but really, really high rates of social solidarity. So, one of the groups that was, the group that was least likely to take their own lives was Jewish people. And the next one after that was Catholics. And then, much more likely to take their own lives were Protestants. Oops, I've jumped forward. And the most likely were atheists. Okay. So why? How is that linked to social solidarity? Well, what Durkheim suggests is that one of the qualities of both Jews and to a lesser extent Catholics at this point in history is both of those groups exhibited really high rates of community life, right? Of social solidarity. So thinking about Jewish people. Jewish people, obviously have oft been, and especially in European society, discriminated against. And we're talking Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, not a particularly happy time for Jewish people. And you would think that, being kind of, subjected to harassment, to pogroms, and other forms of, intimidation or discrimination would make people more likely, more psychologically distressed and therefore more likely to take their lives. And Durkheim said one of those things is true. Of the groups that he looked at, it was Jewish people that had the highest rates of mental disorders, but they also had the lowest rates of suicide. So why? Well, Jewish people, and especially those that, sort of kept to, what we would call Orthodox Jews, people who kept pretty strictly to Jewish cultural and religious practices, have really, really strong social bonds, right? They live in tightly knit communities. Where they see each other all the time, right? One of the things that happens when you say have to keep kosher is you have to live in a place where you have other people that keep kosher, right? So that's following Jewish dietary laws, right? Because you need kosher butchers. You need other Jews, because if a Gentile handles your food, right, then it becomes not, so a Gentile, someone who isn't Jewish. If a Gentile handles your food and you're an Orthodox Jew, you then can't eat it because it is no longer kosher. It's considered impure. So Jews tend to, religious Jews tend to live in really tightly knit communities, right, where they're all together, they see each other frequently, they all go to, the synagogue together, so they know each other. They have really, really tight social bonds. And what Durkheim theorizes is that it's these really tight social bonds that actually act as a protective against suicide, right? The more tight, you see people, you see them, you're with them almost every day, you interact with the same group of people, they know what's going on in your life, and you see your relationship with them, which makes you less likely to do something to yourself. Okay, this is somewhat less true, but still true for Roman Catholics, right? Roman Catholics at this time in Germany also exhibit relatively tight social bonds, right? There's a lot of rules in Catholicism. There's a lot of emphasis on frequently attending church, things like holy days of obligation, where you have to be at church at least every Sunday to be in good standing. A lot of practices like going for confession and all of this stuff that keeps people tightly bonded in close-knit communities. Protestants, nothing against Protestants. A lot of these kind of social bonds are a lot looser in Protestantism. So they're more likely to commit suicide. And according to Durkheim, atheists had the fewest tight social bonds. They were the least likely to, see people frequently, to be in tight-knit communities, and therefore, the most likely to, take this kind of very individual act of taking their own lives. Okay. So, I know there were questions. I'm just teasing you. I don't mind poli-sci. Psychology, on the other hand, I despise. No, I'm kidding. Poli-sci isn't real. What would be the translation of that? Curious. Okay. Are middle ground and middle range theories interchangeable? Yeah, I kind of use them. I kind of use them interchangeably. What is a Protestant? Why don't we talk about that when we talk about religion? Let's say there are Christians who aren't Roman Catholics who split after the Protestant Revolution in 1517. Did Durkheim ever observe suicide in Muslims? No, because at the time there would have been next to no Muslims in Europe. Okay, we'll talk about religion later in the course. I could get sidetracked. I teach a whole course on sociology of religion, so let's not go into that. Did the belief that suicide was a sin influence suicide rates at all? Yeah, and certainly there's really strong prescriptions against suicide in both Catholicism and in Judaism, and those are strongly socially reinforced, right? And it's that social reinforcing of those religious precepts, right? Everybody in your community knows the rules, and if someone does take their life, there's a sort of shame attached to it. And like in Catholicism back then, if you were Catholic and you committed suicide, you couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery. There's a lot of social aspects that would have, come to bear on people. But that's all part of what kept the rates low. So would cults follow a similar pattern with suicides? I suspect so, but cults are a little weird, or new religious movements, and something to, again, talk about when we talk about religion. When talking about psychological disorders, Durkheim found what group had the most. That's an interesting question. Jews by far had the most, followed by Protestants, and then Catholics, and then atheists, who tended to have the fewest. But Jews actually had the most. Okay. I got 10 minutes left. I'm like, how are you all doing? Do you want to keep going for 10 minutes? No? All right, why don't we keep going for 5? I'll keep going for 5. I'll do 5 more minutes, and then we will let you go 5 minutes early so you can make it to your next class or to the bus or go get something to eat. I don't know. Because I'll finish off with suicide so we don't have to talk about such a depressing topic at the top of next class. Okay, so We talk about kind of suicide rates. One of the things that a lot of sociologists have noted is that, as societies have secularized or become less religious, we've seen increasing shares of or increases in the rate of suicide, especially amongst young people. And one of the things that we know, and hey, come take the sociology of youth with me at some point, it's really interesting. As we go forward from the 1960s, young people start to disconnect more and more from all sorts of social institutions. So everything from religion, to bowling leagues. And I only say bowling leagues because there's a very famous book called Bowling Alone, which talks about kind of the breakdown of American social life. Young people have kind of checked out of a lot of institutions. And as we've seen declines in their social bonds, social connections, as more and more young people feel socially isolated, we've seen big jumps in rates of suicide. And one of the biggest jumps we've ever seen starts roughly in 2012. And a lot of theorists think there are two reasons, but the big one is the iPhone. That, social media and smartphones have left young people doing less of this, less, going out and being active with people, and more of, this. Spending 6, 7, 12, 14, 95 hours, scrolling TikTok videos and not interacting with each other in person as much. So we've seen declines in participation in social activities by young people, which has consequently led to higher rates of suicide. Okay, that was 2 minutes, not 5 minutes. Okay, you know what? I don't think I'd start on functionalism in 7 minutes. Functionalism is a pretty huge theory. All right, we'll pick up on functionalism on Tuesday. Have a great weekend. We will see you then.